I was thinking for one of the first questions to maybe raise to the speakers, and something that was sort of touched upon, especially by Doreen, but also in some ways by Lieben, was I want to think about this idea of violence, and how, through this violence, how can we begin to articulate some notion of who is the sort of we who is speaking, and who is the addressee also of this communique. You know, this idea of who is the dispossessed, who is on the outside, if there is an outside, which kind of can relate in some way to the idea of the dissolution of the state. I think Lieben was making a point of saying perhaps the dissolution of the state is not something we should hope for, perhaps it is something we should fear, because of the way that violence can become much more a multiplicity, you know, coming from different sides. And I wonder if the, you know, the growing neoliberal trends that begin to undermine the state in some way and begin to make the state simply a sort of enforcer of some sort of actions is sort of a way in which neoliberalism, rather than social activism, is beginning to try and push for some sort of further dissolution of the state form, at least as we know it today. There seems to be, you know, a growing argument for repression of protest, that what Doreen was mentioning with the events in the USA, the events in Mexico with the disappearance of students, the events that there's a national strike here on Monday. So where do we begin to find a sort of third space for the articulation of something different, you know, perhaps some sort of subconscious of history, something that can open up possibilities? Maybe it is through these concrete utopias that Lieben mentioned, maybe it is in the school, maybe it's outside, maybe it's somewhere else, but maybe just open it up to you guys to begin to question this, of how do we articulate protest in a very broad sense today, seeing the circumstances in which states, corporations seem to criminalize any sort of action against more and more as we advance.
Well, I think I am sometimes very anti-philosophical, even if I'm a philosopher myself. I think we should try to be concrete if we speak about violence. Because, I mean, violence in general becomes then sort of a fetish. I think it's often very concrete. For instance, I have been very busy with the criminalization of activism. Of course, you then have to go into cases. But I think then there you can see concrete structural violence, often by states. For instance, the case of Baaki Ünder, who was prosecuted by the Turkish state all over Europe, in fact. Then you have to make a movement, a we, who say, we cannot have this. This guy is not a terrorist, he is just merely having a different opinion. So you can defend against this concrete violence. And then you can give other examples. For instance, now in Belgium, we see that there is very concrete violence against, let's say, the common man, against families who will be much poorer off, and that they are really giving presents to the rich. So that's very concrete violence, even if it's not literal violence in the sense of physical violence, but it's structural violence. So you make a we. For instance, now we are making a very big movement called Hart boven Hart, le cœur par la rigueur en français. So you make a we. You are not a we, you make a we. Then on the state, as I say, it's many questions, but I'll try to be quick. I think that neoliberalism needs a strong state. So it's often misunderstood. There is not such a thing as a free market. A free market has to be made all the time. So the state is in fact freeing the market constantly for the multinationals. So you need a collaborative state. Of course, I mean, with the tip, you can discuss this, that then the multinationals can go and claim against the state. But in any case, I have been studying civil war lately, and of course we see it all around us. Syria, Iraq, Libya. I think civil war is like dictatorship at the other extreme, is one of the things that we should really fear. So I do believe that even if inside the state there's a dark force, that without a political order, there is no way to avoid lawlessness on the one side in the form of civil war, what I call, of course, classically the return to the state of nature, and on the other hand, the state of exception, the dictatorship, tyranny, which is a sort of top-down excess of sovereignty. And you need a state, somehow, a polis, political order, which has the monopoly of violence, but on the other hand, is controlled by, for instance, the division of powers, etc. So you need a complex system, because this idea that we can just live in a community in an anarchic way, I think is a Rousseauist naivety. Voilà. And of course, on third space, I've written a lot, made a book on heterotopia, and I think for me, heterotopia is the name for this third space, but that's maybe, it's a topic in itself. But my defense today was, amongst others, without going into heterotopia too much, was to try and say, let's not reduce too readily art to politics, which is, in fact, not to make the same mistake that on the other side is made, that in neoliberalism, and it's big time now in Belgium, they want to reduce art and culture to economics. The same mistake can be made to reduce art to politics. I think art incorporates exactly this third sphere, which is at home in heterotopia and other places, like this space, which is in a sense outside the logic of and politics.
Just to add something. Of course, there is different levels or different exception of politics or heterotopy. For example, I think that for a young artist in Bangladesh, there is no such thing as an art community fighting with imagination. There is a strong, accurate fight where you can't escape. So that's it. I live in two civil war for 6 and 5 years, nearly 12 years of my life, in the Great Revolution, the revolt of Solidarność in Poland, and also the pre-Mandela and Mandela rise to power. And during those kind of turmoil time, it was very difficult to imagine. In fact, I think that imagination is not an issue, sorry, for a political fight when it's so accurate and so strong. There is something like barricade and fighting and difficulty to imagine art without any understanding or be far from it. I think you can't, and it doesn't make art better, but it doesn't make art worse. It's simply because you are, as Jean-Paul Sartre used to say, in situation. And it doesn't, he has to do nothing with Henri Gadement. He has to do nothing with propaganda, of course, or the 70s things. He has to do two situations. If you are an artist in the middle of Mengistu dictatorship in Addis Ababa, of course you could with some friends make some imaginary area, but the fact that you meet with some friends 2 times a week, you will be put in jail. So whatever you do, because you can't be few people together regularly meeting. So you know, it's as simple as that. It's a kind of there is a geography of our talk. Maybe I just want to point out that. The other thing is just a remark, a concrete remark, is you speak about violence, and I think that one of the most current violence in our quite soft society, and I say quite soft, compared to what's going on here and there in civil war situation. I don't say that there is no violence in our economical struggle, but let's say compared to the worst in our so-called soft place. The most embarrassing violence is the fear of violence. The fact that security and the speech of security, the politician speak of security is absolutely everywhere. And I prefer to be naive as also as strong as Thomas Hobbes. I mean, for me, I'm not sure about that. I don't feel secure with all those speech of security. And this is, for me, the major violence here. We are living in a violent society by this kind of obsession of security. And of course, I say that because I'm an outlaw, very open and very happy to be. You can't imagine the number of papers I sign per day. Everything students want to do is a matter of law, legalization. This is something I think incredibly violent. And it's always on, of course, for our safety. It's the care. I hate the care. I mean, I think I'm always, I really have a kind of certificate pile that where I sign that I decided to be responsible if they jump from the roof, if they make fire in the center of the square. So because I remember simply that I was young, and really I'm not so old. And I think to myself, but what happens to this society where you can't do what I have done 20 years or 30 years ago? And this is the violence.
I mean, it sounds now very much kind of that the violence is happening to us, so that the state is over there, and these structures exist and we cannot do anything. And I think, I mean, that's what I have been trying to think through, and that I have not come up yet with a very kind of brilliant proposal, but maybe that what has addressed in your talk and like these kind of paradoxical relations, the paradoxical forms, if we want to talk about violence, that we co-produce permanently. I mean, I think this is something that we might have learned perhaps, or this is like a tremendous shift when we think about the realm of contemporary art in times of globalization, where it's impossible, I mean, to grasp the complexity of a political problem. And in that kind of context, I think it's absolutely important to be as precise as possible, but at the same time, not to end up in that what has been called like a folk politics of horizontalism, like to stay in the kind of the framework that one understands, but to understand that the situation that we, I mean, I try to find an example, sorry that I'm so kind of very abstract, that it is a kind of embedded in a network of relations and geographies. And what I want to say, I mean, it's now like a lot of things have been jumping through my mind. With regard to this question of the political, I think it's really to address these kind of theoretical dimension within the political is something important. I mean, maybe I just make a few points. Then what has been addressed already by, like Jean-Luc Godard had been mentioned previously, that the means of art, he talked about photography, that what we do is not a reflection of reality, but the reflection itself is the reality or produce reality. I think this is something really important to think about. Also, the space of art is not necessarily something where the space protected by this institutional or whatever kind of framework allows us to reflect on the outside, but how can we activate politics within that space, within the very space at this very moment, to keep open the space for thinking in order to be able to understand how are we implicated in a disorganized capitalism, a cognitive capitalism, and a global capitalism. So I think this space of art, I think, is even more and more important, not to fetishize as a kind of an industry. Maybe we have to reinvent the term art for that reason in order to open up again that space for thinking. So I think this is the reason why I commit myself to that, otherwise it would be pretty much difficult.
I don't know, thinking about this idea of the sort of redefinition of art potentially, or something like that, you also mentioned in your talk, this importance of creating a distinction between a culture industry and art as such, which was also something that in some ways was touched by Laurent. when you were saying about art, you know, with the real art that is not made with considerations for the market or the market reception, but that is made for some other values, for some other sort of necessities or some other goals in a way, even though it's maybe a bad word. But I mean, could this sort of then, could this sort of renewal of art be a matter of trying to reach out as well into other disciplines and trying to something more transdisciplinary, like maybe what we have here today, where we have some people from different disciplines, even though they're related, talking together, sharing information? Is that perhaps an option, or do the limits of each discipline still need to be maintained? What are the dangers of perhaps blurring these sort of spaces?
First of all, the interdisciplinary approach, especially in Brussels, it's a very old stuff. I mean, we don't invent anything. Interdisciplinary approaches, you know, the matter of the end of the 19th century and all the 20th century, the Art Deco was very interdisciplinary. So it's not a very new thing. So the discussion between writers and poets and visual artists is a very old affair.
And then maybe I'm contradicting myself in a sense, but I would consider it more dialectics. I do believe that we have to defend the right of a novel to just be a novel, and we also, this is just a footnote, be careful that we don't think art and then think visual art. I mean, in fact, the visual arts is the only market, really, in a sense. There's no theater market, really, or much less. So in many art forms, the market is not as powerful as, because of course this absolute commodity that is the unique work. But anyhow, and I think that what we see happening in this interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, which is even maybe a step further, is that the artist as author disappears. And should disappear, because if he doesn't or she doesn't, then there is a sort of recuperation going on of what was a collective process into the portfolio of the artist, which is a deontological problem, I think, for practices today. And for instance, in Bard Farm, all the collective and the artists collaborating will make their contribution into their own portfolio. But what does it give back to the community who is making all this happening? So this is a difficult problem for this sort of art. And a second thing is, so you have dissolution of the author, the artist or architect or whatever artistic subject, let's say, as author, and a dissolution of the object. In the sense that it's not very clear what is, for instance, I showed you two objects that you could call art pieces, but in a sense, it is dissolved in being part of art form. And I think it should be, in a sense, dissolved and given up as part of art form, even if it's maybe a nice contribution to it. So I do see that there is a tendency there, and maybe a richness, which and then immediately becomes political and even economical. Of course, the question is, do we still, is this not going beyond, is it not in a very different way than Hegel was forecasting, going beyond itself of art?
Why to make this kind of competition between the dematerialization and the materialization? I mean, I think this we have learned also has inscribed the dematerialization of the art object has to be inscribed into the canon. I mean, it's important exhibitions at important institutions have institutionalized this kind of institution. I don't know, I think the space of contemporary art in particular is the most, Nimmersatt, what is this in English? Like the most hungry and really greedy monster for new ideas. I mean, invent the next thing that is more dematerial as ever, and you will be branded, because this is how capitalism operates, always for the discovery of that what has not been discovered. So I mean, I think there's really a difference between like the 70s, or where I would like to kind of locate also a politically intended, a politically activated desire, and that what this space could provide in terms of multiple forms of practices. Because I think what I have been thinking about a lot also in the talk by you about the utopia, heterotopia is also really mesmerizing. But what about realism? What about realism also as something that departs from that what we are exposed in the everyday life, like its infrastructures, but not necessarily as a structural analysis, but how to intervene into existing structures. And I think there's where this idea of realism, I mean, Bert Brecht had these ideas about to address the means of production that are the means also of the popular means of, I mean, that would address this kind of Popularität, the Volkstümlichkeit. I mean, this is what surrounds us. And maybe I just can say I have a background as a classical pianist. The reason why I went off there was the absolute blindness to popular culture as something that shapes our everyday conditions. And I think we have to be very serious, joyful, and direct towards addressing this kind of popular means of that surrounds the popularity. Popular culture, mass culture is something really to address. And I think this is where I don't want to step back from the kind of paradigms or imperatives that capitalism puts on the table, because otherwise, I mean, we lose maybe the connection to that what surrounds us. And so I would like to locate the political, maybe this is a better also wording it, into this kind of environment that are very fragile, but where you have like these different forms of sets of knowledge and forms of practices, and also different desires, different languages, and there can be the object or there can be no object. The question is, what does it do? What does it allow us to think? And so on this I think then everything is possible, and this is important. And I think there's a difference between the 70s and this what we desire for, or what we look at, because it's really promising to the very present 21st century. Does it make sense?
But when you say the 70s, do you think of Walter Clark or?
I mean, I think, for example, Lucy Lippard, Seth Siegelau, Douglas Hubler, Hans Hack, Daniel Buren, Adrian Piper. I mean, she's amazing. Well, yeah, but there was the Information Exhibition 1970 at the Museum of Modern Art, where the Art Workers Coalition Group just a few months before had been protesting against the musealization of artistic practice and the power of the museum. And a few months later, there is this huge exhibition, an amazing exhibition that institutionalizes exactly these forms of critique, art and language that had exposed this important work around the Miley events. So yeah, but also I think it's brilliant because, I mean, you have Adrian Piper, nevertheless, is still a brilliant artist, isn't she? And but I mean, where we are at the moment in the 21st century, in the globalization kind of moment, in contemporary art that has been defined by so many thinkers and scholars as something that cannot be separated from a global capitalism and from globalization as an economic, cultural, social force. So, and I think we have to, I mean, not to claim the set of knowledge, but non-knowledge, to unlearn and to undo, I think is really crucial in that context.
I do agree that school is, of course, school is meaning free time, doing nothing. And again, I think to understand this is again close to what art does. It's really doing nothing. Like reading a novel, you do nothing. You don't become a better person, even as people want to sell you that to give the novel a sort of raison d'être. They now say that makes you a better person. It doesn't. It doesn't, of course not. No. Why would it? Why would it? Novels are ambiguous, even immoral often. They speak of the forbidden. It doesn't make you a better person. Maybe a broader person, not a better person. But anyhow. Yeah, well, whatever. Yes, but I mean, whatever. But I mean, any function you say to the novel is reducing the novel to a function. So I would. So in this scholar, this doing nothing, which is of course the essence of philosophy and teaching in a sense, is exactly because I enjoyed your talk on education, because I've been teaching art schools for ages as well. Too long, in fact, in my opinion, but anyhow, that's another question. But
said was maybe convincing as a good education in ethical, sort of ethical attitude or even resilience, but it was not teaching resistance, because I think the question of teaching resistance is in fact the question that spoke to me, because in fact, in a sense, I think it is unethical to teach resistance. You cannot, I have tried it too many times, so I know what I mean, I'm talking here from my experience. You cannot talk to your audience and say, this is urgent, let's now go to the street. You cannot do it to students. In fact, it will not work. So you have to give them the tools to maybe become resistant subjects. So for me, there is a whole question of deontology that immediately political is bad teaching and is bad philosophy and bad theory and whatever, and bad education in a sense.
So maybe I was not clear, but for me it was not the case. I mean,
No, I don't say. No, I say that you were speaking about a good education, but not an education in resistance.
Yes, yes. No. I think simply that for me, to resist is impossible to imagine or to define if, of course, you don't speak about critical thought. And this is the main, this is the basis. Not acceptance reality as it's supposed to be, but just say, no, maybe it could be hell, this could be something else. Or at least it's like that, but the limit is here and so on. And this critical thought, of course, it's the global aim in university and so on. But first, I think it's very often attacked. I could tell you very briefly two things. I make two very banal things, I tell you, for exciting the thought. You have to refuse to be the teacher, to invite other people to teach to your students, to change that. Now it's more and more difficult. Why? Because it's expensive. And people tell you, but you have teachers in the school, why you ask somebody else to come? I say, no, teachers are here to play like an orchestra, but they need solists. And a lot of people say, no, but it's too expensive. Now it's crisis. Students have to listen to their professors, know this amount of people coming back. There is always a very good statement to explain that no, it's crisis, it's impossible. The second thing is the face-to-face appointment. Now we have a law and it explains that maybe when you see students...
I think we know the story.
Perhaps we can
get
another question.
I mean, it's not resistance, it's good education.
But I completely disagree with what has been just said about novels and books. When you read a book, you change and you gain character, you become somebody. Oh yes, you gain structure and you learn to speak steadily and when I read in, I was 12, and when I read Huckleberry Finn, I knew how my life was going to be as someone who wasn't going to take shit from nobody. And that book gave me that, by an American author, Mark Twain. And many other books have given me that, including many other people. When you enter into a book, you enter globally, and you become somebody. You become a structured person.
I couldn't agree more with you that to read, to look at things, to dedicate yourself to an externalized process of thinking helps. Does not mean that it tells you what to do, but it helps you to develop something that will become important for you also as a working instrument. So in this way I would like to, I had prepared another part of the presentation I left out because of the time. The conditions of production, is that what, for me is really the framework when it comes to ways of thinking, political kind of position taking, and to cope with the condition we are living in, to continue to think. But we need the conditions